Hello again. This is Laurie Stanford of the Affirmity's marketing team, and welcome to today's webinar, Preparing for the EU Pay Transparency Directive, a practical guide for compensation leaders. Today's presentation is being recorded and is in listen-only mode and will last approximately 45 to 50 minutes. If you have any questions during today's presentation, you can enter those in the question section of your control panel, and we will answer as many questions as possible immediately after the presentation. If we are unable to answer your question during the allotted time, we will follow up with you individually via email. Also, as you exit today's webinar, you will see a brief survey. Please take a few moments to complete the survey as you exit, and as always, we appreciate your feedback. And finally, a copy of the presentation and the recording will be sent out to all registrants within a few business days. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today, Patrick McNeil and Shannon McCura. Patrick McNeil is a principal business consultant for Affirmity, and he specializes in risk assessment services using both qualitative and quantitative methods to analyze employment practices and inform employment decisions. Dr. McNeil holds a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology and is licensed to practice psychology by the state of Texas. And Shannon McCura is a senior product adoption manager at PeopleFluent, and she partners with prospective and current customers to demonstrate how PeopleFluent compensation software can effectively support their organization's unique compensation philosophy and processes. Since joining PeopleFluent in 2012, she's been involved with software implementation, training, and strategic consultancy on compensation best practices for diverse organizations operating locally, nationally, and globally. She brings a strong academic background, holding both a bachelor's degree in accounting and a master's degree in human resources management. And now, with logistics taken care of, I will turn the webinar over to Shannon to begin today's discussion. Shannon?
Thanks, Laurie. For today's agenda, we are going to talk a little bit about pay equity around the globe, and then, of course, get into the big topic of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And then follow that up with talking about how your compensation planning software can help you with some things from the directive, as well as how Affirmity's global pay equity services can help you. And of course, some wrap up with some Q&A. And next slide, please. To kick things off, we're going to dive in and do a quick poll just to get a sense of where everyone is at on this journey. So our poll is, how prepared is your organization for the EU Pay Transparency Directive? Our options are, we are actively planning and have a clear plan. We are aware, but haven't started our preparations yet. We are just beginning to learn about the directive, or we don't believe the directive will impact our organization. And we will give everyone, I was going to say a few minutes here, but not a few minutes. So we'll give everyone a little bit of time here to go in and get their selections made. And then we're going to bump those selections up against another survey that has gone out, so we can see how we all compare. Probably just, oh, excellent. Thanks, Laurie.
Thanks, Shannon. So it looks like we've got the majority of people that have submitted their responses, and it looks like we are actively preparing and have a clear plan. So that's the majority of the audience is responding. So that's a great news.
That is great news, yeah. Go ahead and go on to our next slide, which actually is rather different than Mercer's, and this was from 2024, so that could be part of it. Mercer's 2024 Global Pay Transparency Survey Report, and at least at that point in time, only a total of 32% of the respondents either agreed or strongly agreed that their organization was prepared for the impact of global pay transparency requirements. So although all this information is going to be great for you all to hear, I am very glad that everybody is well, on their way. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll start talking about pay equity around the globe. And the next slide. And first, we're going to level set and talk about some basic terms. Granted, I'm sure most of you know what these are, but I always like to do a little bit of level setting here. So we've got some, what is the gender wage gap? Well, pretty obvious. This is just the persistent difference between the average earnings, for men and women. And then what is pay transparency? Well, this is the open communication of how compensation is determined within an organization, talking about, your pay philosophy, your pay ranges, and the factors that are influencing pay decisions and how those pay decisions are made in your organization. And then, of course, pay equity is that core HR principle that ensures employees are paid fairly across their work, regardless of any of their protected characteristics. And of course, gender is one of those protected characteristics. And then finally, pay equity versus equal pay. And although a lot of times people do use those two terms interchangeably, they actually are different. Equal pay is more along the lines of that legal requirement that's focused on the same wage for people doing the same job. Whereas pay equity is the broader concept that is focused on removing disparities in organizations for work of comparable value. And there really is a difference there between same job and comparable value. And we'll talk more about that later on. Next slide, please. So the global gender wage gap is narrowing, which is good, but there is still a long ways to go. The 2025 Global Gender Wage Gap Report from the World Economic Forum says we're 123 years away from closing it. But that's better than last year when they said it was 134 years away. And the International Labor Organization is showing progress as well. In 2024, they said women were earning 77.4 cents for every dollar that a man earned. Which is an improvement over 20 years ago when it was 70.1 cents for every dollar. So definitely progress is being made, but there's still a ways to go. Next slide, please. And here, again, another way to look at it from the World Economic Forum, we can see that depending upon where in the world you are, the number of generations it's going to take to reach, parity. So again, just a different way to go and look at it. And next slide, please. One more way that we're going to look at that. And this is again from the Organization for the Economic Cooperation and Development. And we can see here that we can see here by country and looking at the US, Canada, the UK, and the EU combined. Those are the ones highlighted in pink. That in general, the EU combined, and then other countries as well. You can see the EU countries separated. They are doing better at closing the pay gap than many other countries, but obviously they're still on there. So there is a pay gap that still needs to be closed. Next slide, and I'm going to turn it over to Patrick for a bit.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, so on this slide, what we're looking at are the 4 root causes of pay gaps. That is, almost all of the causes you can think of trace back to one of these 4 items. And it's important that these root causes are understood if pay gaps are to be successfully closed. But I'm just going to very quickly hit the highlights here, since this could be its own college course. This is a very deep topic. But the first root is discrimination and unconscious bias, which I think most people are familiar with. And this root causes less value to be attributed to women. It hampers their negotiation power, and it can affect performance metrics. And of course, this negatively affects starting pay, pay rises, promotion chances, and leadership likelihood. The discrimination and bias root also affects leadership likelihood when traditional roles place women in subordinate positions, which then prevent female role models from forming and emerging, and effectively associates leadership with more masculine qualities. Now, the second root is occupational segregation. So boys and girls may receive very different signals from their parents, from society, advertising, entertainment, and any number of other sources that all consistently signal what is appropriate, what's normal, and what's good for boys, and what is appropriate, normal, and good for girls. And these things tend to be different, like quite a bit different in some cases. And they tend to lead men and women to different occupations where segregation can be reinforced by representation issues that are already there, a related lack of role models, and in some cases, hostility and exclusionary norms. And then we've got the third root is the motherhood penalty. Women are associated with additional risks and costs because of things like maternity leave and the perceived need for greater flexibility and the perception of greater attrition risk for various family reasons. Additionally, when women do leave work for periods of time, they typically don't get credit for whatever it is they're doing during that time period, and they may fall behind because of those absences. And then the fourth root is in differences between men and women in certain traits, either on average or in distribution, you know, how the traits are average between the genders or distributed in the populations. And while it's not entirely clear how these differences translate specifically to aspects of various pay gaps, it's easy to see how they might affect pay in specific circumstances. And the most well-researched differences are in the ability to assess and recognize risk, which is generally higher in women, the ability to tolerate risk, which is generally lower in women, agreeableness, which is generally higher in women, and interest in people, which is generally higher in women, and interest in objects, which is generally higher in men. Additionally, women seem to be drawn to something called meaningful work, and this is work that has some, you know, value beyond just the monetary value the work is generating. And meaningful work generally is considerably more value to that. These tend to be more socially responsible jobs or things that do things for other people, and they tend to be work that gives an individual a lot more than just pay in various senses. There's also a whole lot of literature on this as well. The issue with meaningful work is that it draws more people to it in general, and this of course reduces its market value. And as women are more attracted to this type of work compared to men, that starts to generate things or aspects of the pay gap. Okay, so let me talk about some of the statistics Shannon just presented. An important thing to note is that those pay gaps, they represent what are called uncontrolled pay gaps. That is, pay gaps that are based on simple averages or maybe median differences in populations in pay between men and women. So these gaps, they don't consider things like the effective industry, sector, education, work volume, professional level, and like a host of other factors that might relate to pay in reasonable ways, and that might suggest a lower pay gap if they're accounted for. So when reasonable explanations are included in an analysis of pay, typically by using regression techniques, then we tend to get a pay gap that represents the effect of gender once or the effect of gender on pay once we've accounted for all the other factors that might affect pay. So that's called a controlled pay gap. And Forbes conducted an analysis of the US population and estimated that an uncontrolled pay gap in the US is about 16%, which is in line with the pay gap estimated by the OECD that we just showed you. However, when they controlled for factors like job title, experience, education, et cetera, they found a much smaller controlled pay gap of just 1%. And this is a phenomenon repeated in a similar manner just about everywhere. And the difference between a controlled and uncontrolled pay gap, those differences have important implications for the causes of pay differences in various populations. Of note is that functionally a controlled pay gap is always going to be smaller than an uncontrolled pay gap. Now, when the two types of gaps are closer to each other in value, then the uncontrolled pay gap is more likely to be driven by discrimination in pay for equal work, and also biases and cultural components that essentially suggest that it's okay to pay women less than men for doing the same thing. So this is more in line with equal pay for equal work as we have in the US. And the gaps generated like this are more in line with the state of things in the US prior to the turn of the century. However, when uncontrolled and controlled pay gaps are far apart, like 16% versus 1%, then the uncontrolled pay gap is more likely to be driven by discrimination in things like promotion and placement decisions, and how things like cultural steering, gendered occupations, and how different types of work are valued, and trends in life choices between different genders. And this is where most of the world is now. So if the pay gap is going to be addressed effectively, these are the types of things that laws need to focus on. So, and this is one of the things the EU Pay Transparency Directive is aimed at, is these other issues rather than just simply bias and discrimination. All right, I'm gonna turn it back over to Shannon for a sec.
All right, so let's talk a bit about the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk about it at a pretty high level here. And from a high level, this is, of course, new legislation that looks at closing that gender wage gap and increasing pay transparencies in organizations, making it easier for employees to have access to pay information and enforce rights for equal pay should a disparity be found. Each member state has until June of next year to implement this into their national legislation, and that includes making any additional tweaks that they deem necessary. There are reporting requirements that differ by organization size, and this does apply to organizations outside of the EU if they have employees who work within EU member states. So sometimes there are organizations who think that this might not apply to them, but they may need to rethink that if they do have folks that are working in EU member states. And although Brexit did take Northern Ireland out of the EU, due to provisions in the Windsor Framework, Northern Ireland is still needing to be in compliance with the directive. Patrick, back over to you.
Thank you, Shannon. All right, and these are the key areas that employers are going to need to ramp up for and worry about. The first of these areas is pay transparency for job applicants. Essentially, when someone becomes a job applicant, they need some information to the initial pay or its range based on some objective gender neutral criteria, and that needs to be posted or made available. So you have to have systems in place for allowing that information to get to applicants. The second is employee right to pay information. Essentially, employees are going to be able to request information about how pay is set up and structured, and potentially why they're being paid what they're being paid. They can request average information about people who are in essentially the same category of worker that they're placed in. So they can get a lot of information about how people who are sort of like them in the organization are being paid, so that they can make some judgments about essentially how they feel about that. And again, this is an area that companies are going to have to address so that they can make that information available to employees in a timely manner. Now, the third is gender pay gap reporting. I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later on, but you're going to have to, if you're above a certain size, develop statistics that will then go to your employees and either work council or committees or employee representatives, and then they'll have to go to various governing bodies so that they can start organizing and collecting this information from employers, and they potentially will report on that as well. And in conditions where you've got categories of workers that have gender pay gaps greater than 5%, companies are going to have to do joint pay assessments. And this is essentially a deeper dive, and I'll go into this in a little bit more detail later as well. But they're going to have to do a deeper dive into what's causing those differences, and either correct those differences or adjust pay structures to get rid of those differences where possible if they're not justified. And one of the interesting things about the directive is that if an employer doesn't do these things according to the articles in the directive, there's a burden shifting process that goes on where they're going to have to essentially take on the burden of proving that pay discrimination has not occurred in the case someone has a pay discrimination claim. If they have done the items in the articles of the directive, it provides some degree of safe harbor, so the burden doesn't get shifted directly to them. So that's something to keep in mind too when you're considering how you want to set up these processes and engage with creating these statistics and how you're going to report on them. And of course, the directive also provides for remedies and penalties for victims of pay discrimination. There are no caps on these remedies and penalties, and the expectation is that it would be a full amount of what would have been paid to someone absent discrimination plus interest, right? So, there is no sort of limit to the amount of liability companies might be exposed to. All right, so I'm going to turn that back over to, oh wait, no, I'm sorry, I'm going to stay here for a little bit. I'm going to do one more slide and I'll turn it back over to Shannon. Now, as I kind of alluded to, this whole directive and how to deal with it is going to create some sticking points for employers. So the first one is a lot of the comparisons being made in the statistics and a lot of the things that companies are going to have to figure out is how are positions valued to the organization? How are jobs valued to the organization? What process are you going to need to go through to do that? How does that fit with your existing processes and your existing pay scales and pay systems? But at some point, and the countries have not translated this stuff yet, so we're not really sure how different countries are going to apply this aspect of it. The directive says they need to, and they need to create tools for doing this. But depending upon the different country, you may have different methodologies or constrictions or recommendations for valuing jobs. But you should have some idea of how to do this and some methodology internally so that you have a starting place so that you can assign some value to a job. Now, the value I'm talking about is not a value based on economics. It is based on intrinsic aspects of the job. So things like working conditions, responsibility levels, the skills needed to do the job, and so forth. So there's four main factors. In Canada, this has been implemented, so you can kind of look at their laws to see how this might happen. I don't think it's going to be that structured and strict in the EU, but you can do this by forming committees and assigning getting scales together that look at those different factors and sub-factors that could be related to those factors and coming up with a systematic, structured way of valuing jobs. Another thing you can do is look at your existing pay structures and make sure that you have a linkage between those pay structures and the core aspects of job value. So working conditions, skills, responsibility level, and effort is the fourth one. Mental, usually, and physical effort are both considered there. So that's going to be a real challenge. That's something that organizations really need to start working on now so they can get a handle on that. Related to that is this idea of category of workers. Now, the Pay Transparency Directive defines category of workers as people who are in jobs. And these jobs can be totally different from one another, like truck drivers versus reception personnel. And they can be doing totally different things, but if they're valued around the same level, then they're going to be in the same category of workers. So how do you figure out what your categories are? A lot of companies will just use like the Radford scales, but that can be dangerous because I've done a lot of analyses for a lot of companies, and I guarantee you that the intrinsic values of the jobs aren't lining up with the Radford scales. So you have to have some way of legitimately creating these categories of workers, and there's some things you have to consider. So if I've got values for different jobs, what range of values is going to create a category, right? There's a lot of logistics. So, and this is going to be a complicated process. It's something companies should start thinking about. Now, the other one is committee formation. So in the event that you have to do further analyses because you've got a 5% pay gap, You have to do that in conjunction with employee representatives. So you need a process for that. You need to start thinking about how that's going to be done within your organization. And then, of course, I've already mentioned systems for sharing pay information with employees. Shannon's going to talk a little bit about that. Understanding the drivers of pay and pay gaps so that you can deal with those gaps within your organization. So these are legitimate factors that might explain difference. You want to make sure you have the data for those things so that you can run analyses and you can talk about how those pay gaps are legitimate when they are legitimate. And then, of course, getting hold of analytical expertise is something Affirmity provides, and I believe PeopleFluent provides that as well. And then the process of making reasonable and fair pay adjustments. What is that going to look like? If you do these things before, you're actually subject to the law, which I recommend because you don't necessarily have to rely on cooperation with employee representatives. What is that going to look like? And if you do have to rely on cooperation with employee representatives, what's that going to look like? And how is that transition going to take place? So these are all the things that I think companies are going to have the most trouble with, and the things that it would be best to start working on and thinking about as soon as possible. All right, so I'm going to turn that back over to Shannon now.
All right. Thanks, Patrick.
Yeah.
So a little bit about how maybe your compensation planning software can help you in all of this. So centralizing data, first of all, you know, various pay components like your base salary, your bonuses, benefits, allowances, you know, all of those items are needed to define total pay, which you're going to need in your reporting. And integrating your various systems and having all this data in your compensation planning tool eliminates manual and error-prone data collection from multiple systems or having it in multiple spreadsheets. Centralizing data can also be having your various job groupings, job families, functions, you know, all within the comp system as well. And of course, you're going to have, you know, the ties between the job groupings and your salary ranges and your employees all within the comp planning tool as well. And then your salary increases. Again, you know, it can help facilitate reporting that way. And many softwares, you're bringing in additional data points like skills, experience, licenses, certifications, performance ratings. And all of those help you make better pay recommendations right from the start. And that's going to provide you defensible, objective justification where there are legitimate pay differences. And then if there are gaps that are found, you have the ability, of course, to do remediation, you know, within the system. So whether it is the comp and HR team doing some modeling to look at the impact of increases on budget and overall payroll, it might be them spinning up a cycle because they've, you know, there's been found that a group of employees in a department, division, business unit, you know, all need an increase. It could be that your system allows off-cycle or, you know, one-off increases, and a manager or HR is putting an individual through that process, or automatically that person is going through a process because remediation was needed and found. Could be that salary ranges or market data increased and we need to do an adjustment to minimum cycle. So a lot of things that, of course, your software planning tool can do. And we'll see in a couple of the examples coming up some ways that your system can help you be more proactively transparent. You know, with the centralized data, you are more quickly able to respond to employee information requests around pay. And you know, potentially even providing that information proactively to your entire employee population. And already mentioned reporting a couple of times. Of course, you know, your comp system can automate and streamline reporting, both looking at potential gaps during your pay planning cycles, as well as looking at information throughout the year. And reports can be, of course, created for HR and compensation teams to look at, but also to help educate managers and start having them look at their teams and their spans of control. And we'll look at some examples of that as we move forward as well. Next slide, please. But first of all, back to the applicants and that requirement. Integrating your compensation and your talent acquisition or TA software is a great way to help with this. Comp and TA softwares are very closely aligned. If you've noticed in some of the news headlines lately, there's been some acquisitions of TA by some other comp software. So yep, they're definitely integrating. But having those systems closely aligned and making sure that that salary range information, when it's updated in one, is flowing to the other, as well as having that job information updating, making sure that they're in sync, keeping in mind your compensation philosophy and any strategies that you have in plan, in place or in play are also helpful. And then using that also to look at any internal equity to make sure that there are no disparities being created, as you're launching that new job posting with that new grade range information. Next slide, please. And many compensation planning tools have employee-facing profile pages, talent cards, talent profiles, whatever you might want to call them, that you can provide compensation information on. And if it's not in your compensation system, maybe it's in your payroll portal. But these types of profile pages that allow employees access can have data that's updating automatically. So as those salary grade ranges are updated and into the system, as salary rates are changing, that information is automatically updated. And it's there for employees to go in and review. And a lot of these also allow additional data points to be put on those pages to display information either that the organization wants to show, or if there are other local or regional requirements, that information can be provided as well. Next slide, please. And statements are another great way to provide information to employees. And they don't have to be just right around the annual increase time period. They could be year round potentially. And they could be available, on the employee's dashboard, if your system allows that. Maybe provided via email or hard copy as well, depending upon employee preference or organization preference. They could be tabular in nature, like the bottom one. They could be more verbose, like the one over on the right there, or at least my right when I'm looking at it. But they can provide a lot of great information to employees. And one thing that I've seen with our customers, both in the U.S. And abroad, is as you're going through and either creating a career or job framework or updating that career or job framework, we've had a number of customers who've gone through using the compensation system and created a cycle to go in and review that information. So they've got the old and the new in the planning worksheet. Allowing managers and HR to go in and review that. What is the old grade, the new grade, if there are title changes, if there are incentive target changes, maybe now there's a one-time payout because there was a target change. Maybe there's a change to long-term incentive eligibility, so there's a graded payout or something based upon that. So managers can review that, HR can make sure it all looks good, but in the end, it's also going out and communicating that information to the employees. So that can be a great way to get that information out there as well, being proactive. Next slide, please. And part of pay transparency is opening up that black box, that used to be compensation, and building trust between the organization and employees, and statements, and getting that information out there proactively is one way to do that. But also, educating leaders and managers, about your pay philosophy, your pay structure, making sure that they can have conversations about pay is another way to go in and do that as well. So over the next few slides, we'll take a look at some reporting ideas that might be good for leaders to go in and look at. And providing them reports in a system that they're already familiar with can make part of that education process a little bit easier, because they're things that they're already potentially going in and looking at least maybe once or twice a year. And a lot of the reporting that's created doesn't just have to be for the leader. That same report may be able to be used for HR and the compensation teams, just looking at their broader span of control. And of course, I mentioned off-cycle increases once before. In empowering managers, that also can be something as they're starting to look at information. And if they see someone who they do feel proactively is not being paid equitably, giving them the power to go in and initiate an off-cycle increase can boost that, give them that empowering moment, boost that transparency, that cohesiveness, within the organization then as well. Next slide, please. So a great way to start is to have a compensation team create a set of reports for managers and leaders to go in and review. Start simple and then grow that list of reports as your processes and your team's education matures. Providing training and communication to leaders, about the benefits of reviewing the information, how to have pay conversations, things of that nature is a great way to go in and start. Next slide, please. Creating a grid chart, something like this, is a simple item to go in and take a look at. Looking at salary ranges and review. Now, this one happens to be market percentiles. It might be salary grade range, mid, and max, maybe with range penetration or compa ratio on there. But either way, having something like this for managers to go in and review. This happens to be a smart grid within the system where they have the ability to filter, so they could look at a specific grade, a specific title for their direct reports or their span of control. But having them look at this, having them understand, with other additional data points, what they're looking at, how their team is shaping up, with everyone being paid, is a great way to go in and start. And having it be within the compensation system, this may be things that they're already used to going in and seeing, based upon the annual planning cycle. So it can be a great way to go in and start to, start getting them educated and in there. Next slide, please. This actually is from the same chart. It just has some graphs on it. Many systems do allow not only having chart reports to go in and look at, but providing graphs on those charts. We know many people like to look at visualizations of data, so being able to look at that. This also just highlights the fact that systems often do allow you to look at not only your direct reports, but and possibly your span of control as well. Next one. An analytics dashboard. Many softwares allow you to create or have created analytic dashboards for you to go in and look at, allowing you different glimpses of the organization based upon not only your span of control, but the different business units that are out there to go in and take a look at. Maybe it's things that the admins are creating. Some even allow managers to go in and create it. But this can be really a great way to go in and start to look at that information, creating those different looks. This page here happens to be very geared towards pay equity. One in particular happens to be looking at quartile. It's the one, the pink and purple one, which is something that I believe the directive is looking at, how many are in each quartile. Next one, please. This is my final reporting slide here. So we may preliminarily want to look at those gaps in the organization by different slices. Again, specifically looking at that 5% range. This one happens to be created via an Excel report as part of a larger Excel template reporting package that might be out there. This might be within your compensation software. If you are using a data lake or other reporting tools, it might be going out there as well. But certainly starting to look at these things to make sure that you are aware of what's going on with your pay is definitely something to go in and take a look at. So all of these things are ways that your compensation tool can help to provide information around pay, helping to make it more transparent, helping you to start to identify wage gaps. And remember, data from your compensation tool can also be extracted. So, when you need to move on to that next step, maybe for a more in-depth analysis or more official reporting, much, if not all of that data, can come from your compensation planning tool. And Patrick, I'll turn it back to you now.
Oh, thank you, Shannon. All right, and what I'm going to talk about are the things that you're eventually going to have to do if you're in a company above a certain size to comply with the EU Pay Transparency Directive in the various EU countries. And the services that Shannon was just talking about and the items that she was showing you, they help you understand what's going on with pay and pay structures in your system and provide transparency to employees and help managers deal with different pay structures as well. What I'm going to show you are things that speak to the pay equity portion of it, the comparisons that you're going to have to do, how those comparisons are going to need to be structured. And I'm going to start with the valuations of jobs and categories of workers. So I've talked about this a little bit already. But whenever you're assigning a value to a job, like I said, it's not a value based on market forces or market comparisons or anything that has to do with the market. So these are values that have to do with the intrinsic nature of the job and what it's required of people in order to do the job. So these would be compared across your organization so that you could figure out the relative positions of jobs within your organization in terms of value. So the four main areas that you would have to consider are going to be the skills required to do the job, the amount of effort, physical and mental effort needed to do the job, the responsibility level associated with the job, and then the working conditions. And these can be split off into various sub-factors, like I said, if you want to try and figure out, a more systematic way of assigning some value number to a job. So you're either going to have to assign some value number or have a set of buckets where you're going to put jobs into relative to one another based on these four factors. So the buckets, like I said before, could be grade structures. If your grades are refined enough, often grades are too wide and they overlap, by a lot. So that can be a little bit sketchy. Radford scales often, like I said, have fairly wide ranges, or they're assigning positions to different points on those scales based on market value, which can be antithetical to the spirit of the directive, and that could cause some issues down the road. So either those systems have to be modified and adjusted to account for these four factors, or you need a different system in order to categorize jobs into categories of workers based on their value and of course give them value. And then the other aspect of that, like I said, is once you have the value numbers for a job, or you have some idea of what buckets they need to go into, you either have to figure out what range of values is a bucket or how big your buckets are, right? In terms of the value ranges that are going to be within them. So you have to figure out the granularity of similarity in value that's going to be in your different buckets, and those buckets, of course, are going to become your categories of workers. And for U.S. companies and people in U.S. dealing with the U.S. laws, this is a very foreign concept, this idea of categories of workers that are just being defined by the value of the workers within them, because you can have entirely different types of jobs in these categories. So in this case, I've got a warehouse worker, administrative assistant, same bucket, same category of workers, right? But these have different implications in terms of, how gender predominant, the individuals are in these two different types of jobs, but they're in the same category. So there's a lot of things to consider there in terms of how you value jobs and how you create these categories of workers, and then everything else in the analytics flows from the categories of workers assignments or determinations. And just to kind of give you an example of how this has played out, ironically in the UK, which is not in the EU, but this is where we're starting to see some litigation. There was a case that went to tribunal for Next, and the complaint was that sales staff in retail stores were being paid less than warehouse workers, even though the value of those jobs were effectively the same. And the tribunal ruled that yes, that's the case, and there's no legitimate reason for that. And the award that they suggested was about 40 million in back pay to 35,000 workers who are on staff in retail establishments. Of course, they're appealing this, but this has kicked off a series of other lawsuits. So I'm probably going to brutalize these names, but Asda, Tesco, Morrison, Sainsbury, these are a bunch of supermarkets that are catching similar cases, and they're using the same arguments that plaintiffs used in the next case. So that's how these things spread. And of course, the legal structure for doing this quite effectively in all EU countries is being set up by the Pay Transparency Directive. So you really have to pay attention to who is being compared to who in these analyses, and who belongs to the same category workers. So I just want to briefly talk about analytics. So if you're a company above a certain size, depending upon your size, you're going to have a date where you're going to have to produce these analytics and send them to authoritative bodies and your own employees and your own employee representatives. I'm not going to go through these. It's just basically a bunch of pay gap analysis. These are uncontrolled pay gaps. So pay gap for the entire company. You're going to have to do pay gaps by individual components of pay. So like your bonuses and your incentive pay. You'll have to do that in median and average fashion. And then you also have to look at the proportion of males and females receiving complementary and variable component pay. And then the part of the directive is looking at rank ordering essentially people in terms of pay amount, and looking to see what proportion of males and females are in the bottom quarter, middle two quarters, the top quarter, to see how they're distributed in a rough sense across your organization. And then this last one is kind of a big one. You have to do the pay gaps by categories of workers. You may have hundreds of categories of workers. So this is actually quite a bit more work than you might think. And it requires a lot of effort to do this, because you also have to break it down by wage type. So, base wage, bonuses, incentives, and so forth. And that speaks to the second level of analytics that you're going to have to do, is when there is within a category of worker a difference greater than 5%, you're going to need to do some more analytics that potentially would go into something called a joint pay assessment, where you're going to have to involve employee representation in that process. And again, just briefly, you need a proportion of males and females in each category of workers that has this difference greater than 5%. Information on the actual averages of male and female workers in those categories, the difference in average pay between males and females in each category, which you'd already produced in the initial set of analyses, the reasons that those differences in average pay levels exist on the basis of objective general neutral criteria, if any, and those gender neutral criteria will probably be established by jointly by worker representatives and the employer. And the proportion of female and male workers who benefited from any improvements in pay following the return from paternity, maternity, parental care leave, anything of that nature, upon their return. So you have to produce a different set of statistics if you have a 5% difference. Now, also required is measures that address differences in pay if they're not justified on the basis of objective gender neutral criteria. So you essentially have to fix the pay so that the gap doesn't exist anymore, and an evaluation of the effectiveness of measures from prior joint pay assessments as time goes on. What we suggest is that in addition to those statistics, you also run regression analyses where possible, to see if gender neutral explanatory variables can bring those 5% differences to below 5%, and then create charts and graphs to help decision makers and committees see how gender neutral explanatory variables relate to pay differences, so that they can see very clearly that those pay differences are legitimate. And just to note here that the directive implies that if an employer can justify average pay differences at or above 5% for a category of workers using gender neutral criteria as established jointly by the workers' representatives and the employer, then you don't have to go into a joint pay assessment. Or if the employer closes the gap just by modifying pay within 6 months of pay reporting, then you also don't have to go into a joint pay assessment. Otherwise, you have to coordinate with employee representatives to figure out what's going on with the pay gap, and then essentially fix the issue so that you don't have a pay gap above 5%. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Shannon to wrap us up.
All right. Next slide. We'll just do a quick little wrap up here. So just some high-level takeaways. We know the gender pay gap is narrowing, and it is different based upon each region and country, and that there are multiple complex factors that go into and contribute to that pay gap. Pay transparency is a key strategy to closing the pay gap, and the EU Pay Transparency Directive aims in assisting to close that gap. And using technology such as compensation planning software and pay analysis tools can help to facilitate compliance and transparency. And I think we have one more poll here. For anyone who's interested, if you would like more information about PeopleFluent compensation planning software, if you'd like more information about Affirmity and pay analysis services for detecting salary disparities, if you'd like information on both or neither one, please check the appropriate box. We'd greatly appreciate it. I think this will stay up for a minute or so here, but I think we'll go ahead and take questions if there are any questions.
All right, thanks, Shannon and Patrick. We do have some questions that have come in from the audience, so we'll get started on those in the remaining time that we have left. The first question is, what does this mean for expats? Let's see, where relocation and other pay elements are commonly used and represent potential pay gaps to other peers. Same question on grandfathering cases. I don't know, Patrick, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, you know, I'm looking through the directive because it's in there. there is a provision that talks about expats. And I honestly, I cannot remember if they're included or excluded when you're considering pay structures. Shannon, do you remember? Because that's a good question.
I don't remember off the top of my head. I know it's in there too. That's a
detailed question. I appreciate that. It is definitely in there. I don't know where it is, and I can't remember exactly what it says, but I believe that they're excluded, but I don't want you to take that to the bank. We'll try to write that up and find that and send that out to the attendees.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, the next question is there a minimum number of employees in a country or overall that would trigger the requirement? Or is it required even if only 1 or 2 employees?
Do you want to take that, Shane?
I believe it's 100. Isn't that
yeah. So the analytical requirements that I showed on the last few slides, those are triggered at 100, and there are dates at which, depending upon the size of your company, you'll be subject to those. The first date is June of 2027, which is roughly a year after the translation has to happen, and that's for larger companies, 250 or more. 100 to 259. You only have to do it every 3 years, but it's still that same date. At 100, you have until 2031 in order to do it. All the other requirements, the transparency requirements, you can't use past history. You have to give information to applicants on pay ranges. You have to give information to employees who request it, information about what's going on with the pay system. That stuff happens as soon as the law becomes active should be June of 2026. Now we're already seeing some countries try to delay that, so I'm not sure how that's going to play out. But all companies, even if there's 1 employee in it, would be subject to those as of that date.
Okay. The next question, can we also provide the pay position versus their peers?
Can you say that again?
Can we also provide the pay position versus their peers?
pay position versus their peers. I don't think I understand what the question is. Do you get that, Shannon?
I think they're asking if they can provide where the employee stands in relation to their peers, but I'm not 100% sure I'm understanding the question correctly either. So as part of the proactive information, where they stand against an average of their peers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you can do that, of course. The directive is only requiring you that you give them an average number to compare them to, and then information about their pay systems. But I don't think there's anything against the law to give them additional information that would create more transparency.
Okay. All right, so this question is, since the EU pay directive also addresses variable pay and more pay elements other than the base pay, for example, allowances, overtime, shifts, etc., and even benefits, do you plan to include these elements in the PeopleFluent data and analysis?
Absolutely. As long as you are bringing them into the system, we certainly can include those in whatever analysis that you're doing within PeopleFluent. And we have customers already that are bringing that information in.
Yeah, and the analyses we've been doing for clients already include essentially a total pay line, and then all the base pay, and then all the ad pay variables, and if there's a difference, how those other variables are contributing to that difference in a percentile fashion and in an absolute fashion. So it gives you a lot of information about how your different pay types are contributing to an overall pay difference, and that makes it a lot easier to figure out, what types of pay are driving the pay differences. And also, if you go down, we got other charts that show you performance and tenure and all that kind of stuff, and whether that's going the same direction as these different things. So just visually, we try to provide all that information, as well as running regressions and things like that, which can help you figure that out as well.
Okay. Can you share information on how your clients are preparing in terms of benefits?
I don't have a great answer for how they're preparing in terms of benefits, other than doing comparisons and looking at it holistically as to how they're and what they're providing. But apologies, I don't have a better answer than that at this time.
Yeah, that's really hard to do because benefits are going to be different in different countries. So I've got one client that's just looking at sort of because a lot of companies don't have good data about the benefits and how much that's contributing to pay across their organization. So they're kind of putting in like a percentile factor based on market statistics in different countries. This is just a preparatory thing. I think you're going to have to be more detailed and involved once the transparency directive is applying to you. But ideally, you would get the value of the benefits for every job, and that would just be included as a pay type. And you would run that. I don't know if some countries are going to have any exclusions, or if they're going to be able to do that. So a lot of times when you see these types of laws, if everyone has access to the same stuff, you don't have to include like vacation time and benefits and all this other things, because there are no decisions being made about that. Everyone just has the same things. We'll see how that translates into the different countries. I think companies are going to have to do a lot of different things in different countries, though.
All right. It looks like we're at the top of the hour. So Patrick, if I can get you to go to the next slide, and we'll just kind of give everybody a few reminders before we close out today. Just want to remind everyone that the presentation and recording will be sent out to all of the registrants within a couple of business days. And today's session is SHRM and HRCI credit approved. That information will be included in your follow-up email. And please take a few moments to complete our post-event survey as you exit today to let us know how we did. And thank you so much, Patrick and Shannon, for all the great information. And we appreciate everyone taking time out of their day to join us today. And we look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.